In a maximum security cell bathed in the cold, synthetic glow of fluorescent lights that buzzed like trapped insects against glass, a man whose body was a canvas of elaborate ink sat in absolute stillness, his tattooed hands resting flat against his thighs, his chest rising and falling in the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who had already made peace with the end. Tomorrow morning at 900 hours, he would be executed. But before the state claimed his life, he made one final request. A request that sent tremors of confusion through every level of the correctional system. He didn't ask for his defense attorney. He didn't ask for his estranged brother or the distant cousins who'd abandoned him after the verdict. He didn't ask for a chaplain to absolve his sins or request the customary last meal of prime rib and whiskey. He asked to see a maid, a foreign contract worker who had scrubbed floors and polished silverware in his sprawling estate for barely 11 months. Michelle Sparks, a woman so invisible to his criminal organization that not a single lieutenant could recall her face or even confirm she'd existed. The warden considered it a breach of protocol, possibly even a security risk. The corrections officers anticipated coded messages, perhaps instructions to liquidate hidden assets or activate sleeper cells in his crumbling empire. But when the slender woman in a crisp black dress and white apron stepped through the reinforced door of the visitation chamber, flanked by armed guards whose hands never left their sidearms, everything shifted. Instead of offering comfort or sentimental farewell, she spoke words that made the feared syndicate leader's dark eyes flare with the first spark of emotion he'd shown in 4 years of incarceration. The supervising officers exchanged bewildered glances, their training failing to provide context for what was unfolding before them. No one in that room understood they were about to witness a revelation that would tear through the carefully constructed narrative of guilt, expose a conspiracy that had infected the highest corridors of power, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous witness is the one nobody bothered to see. Stay with us because this story will challenge everything you thought you knew about justice and betrayal. Before we dive in, show this story some love by hitting like and subscribe. And I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your country in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories reach across borders and time zones. The Greystone Federal Penitentiary, stirred to life hours before the city beyond its 30-foot concrete perimeter, began its morning routine. Long before the first pale threads of sunrise could penetrate the shadows cast by guard towers and coils of concertina wire that crowned the facility like a crown of thorns. An oppressive, suffocating quiet settled over the corridors on this particular morning, the kind of silence that only materialized on days when the state exercised its ultimate authority. Even the correctional officers, veterans who had overseen dozens of executions and weathered every conceivable form of human desperation, moved with an uncharacteristic heaviness in their steps today. Their polished boots struck the waxed linoleum with a cadence that echoed less like the footfalls of professional security personnel and more like the measured beat of a dirge played at a military funeral. At the terminus of death row, in a cell stripped of all amenities save for a bolted metal bed frame and a single wooden chair that had been inspected 3 times for potential weapons, sat a man whose very name had once turned the blood of rivals to ice and made city officials scramble for protection. His name was Hunter Torrent, former architect of a global mafia syndicate, former puppet master who had controlled smuggling routes across 4 continents, former apex predator who commanded armies from the shadows, now reduced to inmate number 44,127 in an orange Department of Corrections jumpsuit, counting down the final grains of sand in an hourglass that could not be turned. But Hunter wasn't shaking. He wasn't bargaining with God or ancient spirits. He wasn't burning through the phone privileges his legal team had secured for these final hours. He sat perfectly erect on that hard wooden chair, his spine refusing to bend despite the crushing weight of his approaching mortality, hands folded with almost ceremonial precision in his lap, eyes locked with laser focus on the heavy steel door that stood between him and whatever came next. His traditional tattoos, serpentine dragons whose scales seemed to shimmer in the artificial light, phoenixes rising from flames of ink that climbed from his forearms and vanished beneath the prison-issued fabric, appeared to move with each breath, as if the mythical creatures were stirring from sleep. The guards monitoring him through the triple-reinforced observation window exchanged uneasy glances, their professional composure cracking at the edges. "He hasn't moved a muscle in over 2 hours," the younger officer whispered, his voice tight with tension he couldn't fully explain. "I know," his partner responded, barely louder than a breath. "It's unnatural, like he's waiting for something specific, something none of us can see coming." Hunter registered every syllable through the silence, but his face remained an impenetrable mask. His consciousness had already escaped these walls, traveling backward through time to days before the conviction, before the slaughter that painted his estate crimson, before the night when his entire world collapsed into chaos and blood. He could almost smell the sandalwood incense that had burned constantly in his study. He could almost hear the whisper of footsteps in the marble hallways, belonging to someone who moved through his empire like a ghost, present but never perceived. He could almost see her face, the quiet woman in the maid's uniform who witnessed the unthinkable while everyone else looked away. A sharp electronic tone shattered the stillness as the security doors initiated their unlocking sequence, electromagnetic bolts sliding back with mechanical precision. Every guard in the corridor snapped to attention, shoulders squared, hands positioned near their equipment. The warden entered with measured steps, flanked by 2 administrative officials clutching leather portfolios, their expressions carved from granite and procedure. This was the ritual, the final verification, the last bureaucratic checkpoint before the machinery of death began its irreversible process. "Hunter Torrent," the warden announced, his voice cutting through the atmosphere like a blade through silk. "You will be transferred to the execution facility in approximately 2 hours. If you have any additional final requests beyond the one we have already authorized under extraordinary circumstances, state them now." Hunter lifted his gaze with deliberate slowness, his eyes, dark as midnight water and containing depths that few had ever dared to explore, locking onto the warden with an intensity that made the seasoned administrator shift his weight almost imperceptibly. Hunter's voice emerged low and steady, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I have nothing further to request. The woman I asked for is the only person I need to see before this ends." The warden's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd been running Greystone for 17 years, had overseen 43 executions, and prided himself on maintaining protocol even when inmates screamed, wept, or hurled obscenities at the heavens. But this case gnawed at him in ways he couldn't articulate to his superiors. "Mr. Torrent, I need to confirm for the record that you understand the terms of your approved visitation. You have 1 brother, 3 cousins, and a niece who have all submitted formal requests to see you during these final hours. Your legal team has been calling every 30 minutes. Your former business associates have hired a senator to intervene on their behalf for just 5 minutes of your time. And yet you've refused every single one of them to spend your last moments with." He glanced down at the paperwork in his hands, as if the name itself might offer some hidden explanation. "Michelle Sparks, a domestic worker with no familial relationship to you, no documented friendship, no apparent significance to your case or your life. Can you explain this decision?" Hunter's expression remained granite. "I don't need to explain it. I simply need you to honor it." The administrative official on the warden's left, a thin woman with silver-framed glasses and a file folder thick enough to serve as a weapon, cleared her throat. "Mr. Torrent, we're required by law to verify that you're of sound mind when making decisions regarding your final hours. This request has raised concerns at multiple levels of review. The Attorney General's office has asked us to confirm that you're not being coerced, that this isn't some form of coded communication with remaining elements of your organization, and that you understand the finality of refusing to see your actual family members." "I understand perfectly," Hunter replied, each word precise and deliberate. "My brother testified against me to secure immunity for his own crimes. My cousins dissolved their connections to me the moment the verdict was read. My niece was 9 years old when I was arrested and has been raised to believe I'm a monster who deserves what's coming. None of them want to see me out of love or concern. They want closure, or they want to feel they did their duty, or they want to tell themselves they tried. I'm not interested in performing forgiveness for people who abandoned me when it mattered." The warden exchanged glances with his colleagues, and in that silent communication passed years of experience trying to decode the behavior of condemned men. Some sought redemption in their final hours, begging forgiveness from victims' families and clergy members who smelled of incense and spoke in platitudes. Others descended into rage, thrashing against restraints and cursing everyone from their arresting officers to the judges who sealed their fate. A rare few simply shut down, becoming hollow shells that had to be carried to the execution chamber like mannequins in orange jumpsuits. But Hunter Torrent fit none of these established patterns. He sat before them with the bearing of someone attending a business meeting rather than counting down to his own death, and his single request made no logical sense within the framework they used to understand human behavior under extreme duress. "The thing that troubles us," the warden continued, choosing his words carefully, "is that this woman, Michelle Sparks, barely appears in any documentation related to your case. She was employed at your estate for less than a year. She wasn't called as a witness. She didn't submit victim impact statements. She left the country shortly after the incident and only returned last week when we contacted her regarding your request. Our background check shows she's currently working at a hotel in the city, living in modest circumstances, and by all accounts has no connection whatsoever to your criminal enterprise or your personal life. So I'll ask you directly, as one human being to another in these final hours, why her?" Hunter's fingers interlaced slowly, deliberately, and for the first time since the warden entered his cell, something shifted in his eyes. Not fear, not anger, but something that looked almost like respect for a memory that lived behind his unreadable expression. "Because she's the only person who was there that night who didn't have a reason to lie. Everyone else in my organization had something to gain or lose depending on which version of events they told. But Michelle, she was invisible. She moved through my home like air, noticed by no one, trusted by default because people like me don't think people like her matter enough to pay attention to. That invisibility made her the most reliable witness to my life, and potentially to my death." The administrative official's pen stopped moving across her notepad. "Are you suggesting she has information relevant to your conviction?" "I'm suggesting," Hunter said, his voice dropping even lower, "that sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who see everything most clearly. And I'm suggesting that if I'm going to die today, I deserve to spend my last conscious moments with the one person who might actually tell me the truth about what happened when my memory went dark." The silence that followed pressed against the walls of the cell like a physical presence. The warden had read Hunter's file so many times he could recite it from memory. The massacre of 17 high-ranking members of his own syndicate, each one killed with clinical precision using weapons registered to Hunter himself, all of them gunned down in his private estate, while he allegedly stood over them in a drug-induced rage that he claimed not to remember. The prosecution had painted him as a paranoid tyrant who decided to eliminate potential rivals in one brutal purge. The defense had argued unsuccessfully that he'd been drugged and framed, but without evidence or credible witnesses, the jury had deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on 17 counts of first-degree murder. "If she has exculpatory evidence," the warden said slowly, "your attorneys should be the ones talking to her, not you in a death row visitation room with less than 2 hours before your execution." "My attorneys," Hunter replied with the faintest edge of bitterness finally creeping into his voice, "had 4 years to find evidence and witnesses. They failed. They built their entire defense on reasonable doubt and character witnesses who couldn't overcome the physical evidence that said I pulled those triggers. But they never found Michelle because they never thought to look for someone whose entire job was to be forgettable. I did. It took me 3 years of thinking through that night, replaying every detail I could remember before the wine made everything blur, and I kept coming back to a shadow I saw moving in the service corridor. A shape that disappeared into the walls. Someone who survived because no one remembered she existed. The officials absorbed this, and the weight of what Hunter was implying began to settle over them like frost forming on glass. If he was telling the truth, if this maid had witnessed something that could potentially alter the narrative of his guilt, they were standing at the threshold of a situation that could spiral far beyond standard execution protocol. "We'll honor your request," the warden finally said, his voice heavy with implications he couldn't yet fully articulate. Michelle Sparks will be brought to the visitation facility within 90 minutes. The meeting will be recorded, monitored, and limited to 15 minutes as per regulations. But Mr. Torrent, I want you to understand something. If this is a game, if this is some final manipulation to create doubt or delay, it won't work. The execution will proceed as scheduled, unless you produce something concrete enough to warrant intervention from the governor's office or the Supreme Court. And at this hour, that's virtually impossible. Hunter nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than agreement. I'm not playing games, Warden. I'm just trying to die knowing the truth, even if I'm the only one who ever hears it. The warden remained in the cell, his presence filling the narrow space with institutional authority that had been refined over decades of service. He unfolded a laminated document from his portfolio, the plastic covering catching the fluorescent light and casting small reflections across the concrete walls. This was the part of his job that never became easier, regardless of how many times he'd performed it, regardless of whether the condemned man before him had murdered one person or 17. The ritual remained the same, cold and procedural, designed to strip away humanity in favor of clinical efficiency. Mr. Torrent, I'm now required by federal statute to inform you of the execution procedure that will be administered at 900 hours this morning. You have the right to refuse to hear this information, but I'm legally obligated to offer it. Do you wish to be informed of the process? Hunter's gaze never wavered. I've known exactly how I'm going to die for 4 years, Warden, but if it brings you comfort to recite it, I won't stop you. The warden's mouth tightened into a line that suggested he'd heard every variation of bravado and acceptance that the human mind could produce when facing mortality. He'd seen men who'd killed without remorse weep like children when confronted with their own approaching end, and he'd seen men who'd committed crimes of passion face death with the serenity of Buddhist monks. Hunter Torrent, however, occupied a category that unsettled him more deeply than either extreme. A man who seemed to be observing his own execution from a distance, as though he were attending someone else's funeral. The procedure consists of 3 distinct stages, the warden began, his voice taking on the measured cadence of rehearsed speech. At approximately 8:45 hours, you will be escorted from this cell to the preparation area adjacent to the execution chamber. You will be accompanied by a minimum of 4 correctional officers, and you will be secured with standard restraints during transport. Once in the preparation area, you will be asked to change into the designated execution garments, which consist of a simple cotton shirt and trousers. You will be permitted to retain your dignity during this process, and a chaplain will be available if you request spiritual counsel at that time. Hunter's breathing remained steady, his chest rising and falling with mechanical regularity. The tattoos that covered his forearms seemed to pulse with each heartbeat, the inked dragons appearing to coil more tightly around his muscles, as if preparing for a battle they could not win. At approximately 8:50 hours, you will be transferred to the execution chamber itself. The chamber is a sealed room with observation windows that allow witnesses to view the procedure. You will be secured to a gurney using leather restraints at 5 points, your chest, both wrists, and both ankles. These restraints are necessary to prevent involuntary movement during the chemical administration. You will be positioned facing upward, and your arms will be extended to facilitate intravenous access. 2 IV lines will be inserted, 1 in each arm, as a redundancy measure to ensure the chemicals can be delivered even if one line fails. The younger guard standing outside the cell shifted his weight uncomfortably, and the sound of his equipment belt creaking seemed unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. He'd participated in 3 executions since joining Greystone's staff, and each one had left him unable to sleep for days afterward, haunted by the clinical precision with which the state transformed living men into corpses. The witness gallery will contain representatives from the victims' families, members of the press, your legal team if they choose to attend, and any witnesses you've personally designated, though I understand you've declined to name anyone for this purpose. The windows are equipped with curtains that will remain closed until the exact moment of execution, allowing you a brief period to compose yourself without being observed. At 900 hours precisely, the curtains will open, and the execution protocol will commence immediately unless a stay order is received from the governor's office or a federal court. Hunter's fingers, still interlaced in his lap, remained perfectly still. No tremor, no fidgeting, no unconscious picking at cuticles or cracking of knuckles that the warden had seen in so many others. It was as if the man had already separated his consciousness from his physical body, achieving a state of detachment that should have been impossible for someone with minutes of life remaining. The execution itself will proceed in 3 chemical stages, the warden continued, his eyes fixed on the laminated sheet, though he'd long since memorized every word. Stage 1 involves the administration of sodium thiopental, a barbiturate that will render you unconscious within 30 to 45 seconds. You will feel a sensation of cold spreading through your veins from the injection site, followed rapidly by a loss of awareness. This chemical is designed to ensure you feel no pain during the subsequent stages. The medical team monitoring your vital signs will verify unconsciousness through established neurological protocols before proceeding. The administrative official with the silver-framed glasses had stopped taking notes, her pen hovering motionless above her legal pad, as if she too had been caught in the gravitational pull of the moment. She'd attended briefings, read case files, and reviewed execution protocols in the abstract comfort of her office. But standing here in the cell with Hunter Torrent, watching him receive his death sentence for the second time, brought a visceral reality to the process that no amount of paperwork could convey. Stage 2 involves pancuronium bromide, a paralytic agent that will stop all voluntary muscle function, including respiration. Once this chemical is administered, you will be unable to breathe on your own, though you will remain unconscious from the first injection and should experience no sensation of suffocation. The paralytic serves to minimize physical movement during the final stage, which is a consideration for the witnesses observing the procedure. Hunter finally spoke, his voice carrying a note of dark humor that seemed inappropriate given the circumstances, yet somehow fitting for a man who'd built an empire on understanding the economics of death. So the second chemical is for the comfort of the people watching me die, not for me. Interesting that even in execution, we maintain the theater of civility. The warden didn't acknowledge the observation, though something in his eyes suggested he'd had the same thought many times over his career. Stage 3 involves potassium chloride, which will stop your heart within 1 to 2 minutes of administration. This is the chemical that will cause clinical death. Once your heart has ceased beating and brain activity has stopped, the attending physician will officially pronounce death, and the time will be recorded in the permanent record. The entire process from the opening of the observation, curtains to the pronouncement of death typically takes between 7 and 12 minutes, depending on individual physiological factors. The silence that followed felt like a held breath, as though the cell itself was waiting for Hunter to react, to finally show the fear that every human being supposedly carried in their DNA when confronted with extinction. But he simply nodded once, acknowledging the information with the same neutral acceptance he might show to a waiter reciting the evening's specials. Your body will remain in the chamber for approximately 15 minutes after death is pronounced, allowing time for witnesses to depart and for the medical team to complete their documentation. Following this period, you will be released to the funeral home designated in your final arrangements, or if no arrangements have been made, to the state facility that handles indigent burial. I understand you've made provisions with a private funeral home. Is that correct? Yes, Hunter confirmed. Everything's arranged. No service, no viewing, no monument, just cremation and disposal. I don't want anyone making a shrine out of my ashes or a pilgrimage site out of my grave. The warden folded the laminated document and returned it to his portfolio with a finality that seemed to close some invisible chapter. Do you have any questions about the procedure, Mr. Torrent? This is your opportunity to ask for clarification on any aspect of what I've described. Hunter's eyes remained fixed on some point beyond the warden's shoulder, perhaps seeing through the concrete walls to a memory that played out in his mind with perfect clarity. Just one question, Warden. In all the executions you've overseen, have you ever had someone survive? Have you ever strapped a man to that gurney, inserted those needles, opened those curtains, and then had something happen that stopped the whole machinery of death from turning. The warden's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression of discomfort crossing his weathered face. In 17 years, I've had 3 stays of execution. 2 came weeks before the scheduled date, allowing time for appeals to be processed through the courts. 1 came 14 hours before the execution, based on new DNA evidence. But I've never had a stay once the condemned man was in the chamber itself. Once that door closes behind you, Mr. Torrent, history suggests there's no walking back out. Hunter smiled then, a slight curve of his lips that contained no warmth but suggested he knew something the warden didn't, held some card that hadn't yet been played. History is full of precedents, warden, right up until the moment it isn't. Hunter's mind slipped backward through time as the warden and his entourage departed, the electronic locks engaging with their decisive metallic chorus that marked the boundary between the present moment and the past that had brought him here. The cell around him dissolved, replaced by memory so vivid it carried the weight of physical reality. And suddenly, he was no longer inmate 44,127, waiting for death, but Hunter Torrent at the apex of his power, standing in the private study of his estate on the night everything ended. The estate had been a fortress disguised as elegance, a sprawling compound of marble corridors and vaulted ceilings that spoke of wealth accumulated through channels that never appeared in legitimate ledgers. That particular evening, the air throughout the building had been thick with sandalwood incense, the aromatic smoke curling through the hallways in lazy spirals that caught the warm glow of amber lighting. Hunter had always preferred the scent during important meetings, claiming it sharpened his focus and calmed the volatile personalities of men who carried guns beneath tailored suits and settled disputes with violence that never made headlines. 17 of his highest-ranking operatives had gathered in the main conference room, a space dominated by a table carved from a single massive slab of black walnut that had cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. These were not the street-level enforcers or the expendable foot soldiers who handled the messy work of collection and intimidation. These were the architects of his empire, the regional commanders who controlled territories spanning continents, the financial strategists who transformed blood money into legitimate investments, the logisticians who moved contraband through borders as though customs barriers were merely suggestions. They'd assembled to discuss expansion into markets previously held by a rival syndicate that had recently collapsed under federal prosecution, an opportunity that could double Hunter's operational capacity if executed correctly. He remembered standing at the head of that table, remembered the weight of their attention as he outlined the strategic approach, the calculated risks, the expected returns. His second-in-command, a man named Dalton Graves who'd risen through the ranks on a combination of ruthless efficiency and strategic brilliance, had sat to his immediate right, nodding along with each point, occasionally interjecting observations that demonstrated his comprehensive understanding of the organization's infrastructure. To Hunter's left, his financial advisor had pulled up spreadsheets on a tablet, translating criminal enterprise into columns of numbers that could have belonged to any multinational corporation. The meeting had proceeded smoothly for the first hour, each agenda item addressed with the professional detachment that characterized Hunter's leadership style. He didn't tolerate dramatics or displays of ego during business discussions, had built his reputation on treating criminal enterprise with the same analytical rigor that legitimate CEOs applied to quarterly earnings reports. The incense had grown thicker as the evening progressed, the ventilation system struggling to clear the aromatic fog that accumulated near the ceiling like storm clouds gathering before rainfall. Midway through the second hour, Dalton had suggested they toast the new venture with the vintage wine Hunter kept in his private collection, bottles that had been acquired through methods that would horrify their original vintners. It had been a reasonable suggestion, the kind of ceremonial gesture that marked the conclusion of productive negotiations, and Hunter had agreed without hesitation. Dalton himself had retrieved the bottle from the climate-controlled cellar, had opened it with the proper ceremony, had poured measures into crystal glasses that caught the light and transformed the dark liquid into something that looked almost like communion wine. Hunter had raised his glass along with the others, had spoken a brief acknowledgement of their collective ambition and the profits that awaited them if they executed the plan flawlessly. The first sip had tasted correct, the complex notes of aged Cabernet filling his mouth with the expected combination of dark fruit and oak and tannin. But the second sip had carried something else, a metallic undertone that didn't belong in a wine of that quality, a chemical bitterness that registered wrong on some instinctive level that bypassed conscious analysis. He'd paused, the glass halfway to his lips for a third taste, and in that moment of hesitation, he'd noticed that Dalton hadn't actually drunk from his own glass, had merely wet his lips and set the crystal down while the others continued toasting. The observation had lodged in Hunter's mind like a splinter, too small to demand immediate attention, but present enough to create discomfort. He'd tried to shake the paranoia, tried to tell himself that years of operating in a world built on betrayal had made him see threats in innocent gestures, but his hand had nonetheless moved to set his own glass down on the table with exaggerated care. The room had begun to feel warmer, the incense smoke seeming to press against his face like humid air before a thunderstorm, and when he'd tried to stand, to excuse himself under the pretense of retrieving additional documents, his legs had responded with frustrating sluggishness. The next memories existed as fragments, scenes from a film where entire reels had been removed, leaving only disconnected images that refused to form a coherent narrative. He remembered Dalton's face looming closer, features arranged in an expression that could have been concern or could have been something else entirely, impossible to read through the fog that had descended over Hunter's perception. He remembered voices speaking in urgent tones that seemed to come from underwater, words distorted beyond comprehension. He remembered the sensation of his own body becoming foreign territory, his arms hanging at his sides like dead weight, his vision tunneling until the world consisted of a shrinking circle of light surrounded by encroaching darkness. And then, through the pharmaceutical haze and the thick curtains of incense smoke, he'd seen movement in his peripheral vision. Not the expected presence of his lieutenants seated around the conference table, but something else, a shadow that slipped along the wall near the service entrance, a shape that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His drug-compromised mind had registered it as a hallucination at first, another symptom of whatever chemical cocktail was rewriting his neurological responses. But the shape had possessed too much definition, had moved with too much purpose to be merely a trick of failing synapses. The shadow had lingered in the doorway that led to the service corridor, the narrow passages that allowed household staff to move through the estate without disturbing the primary occupants, invisible infrastructure that supported the visible luxury. For a fraction of a second, Hunter's swimming vision had sharpened enough to register details. The dark fabric of a uniform, the pale oval of a face turned toward the conference room, eyes reflecting the amber light like an animal caught in headlights. Then the shape had dissolved backward into the corridor, vanishing as completely as if it had never existed. The gunfire had started moments or hours later, temporal measurement having lost all meaning as the drug pulled Hunter deeper into a waking nightmare where he remained conscious enough to perceive but too compromised to act. He'd heard the reports, each one sharp and distinct despite the chemical fog, heard them continue with methodical rhythm that suggested execution rather than combat. 17 shots in total, each one perfectly placed, each one final. He'd felt his own hand being moved, felt the familiar weight of his personal weapon being pressed into his palm, felt his fingers being arranged around the grip with careful positioning that his numb extremities couldn't resist. When the police had arrived, responding to a silent alarm triggered by security systems that monitored for weapons discharge, they'd found Hunter standing in a room transformed into an abattoir, 17 bodies arranged around the conference table in various states of collapse, each one killed with clinical precision. His weapon had still been in his hand, powder residue coating his fingers, security footage showing him raising the gun again and again, firing with the mechanical efficiency of someone completing a checklist. The ballistics had matched perfectly. The forensic evidence had been overwhelming. His own partial fingerprints had been on every shell casing recovered from the scene. And through all the investigations and interrogations and eventual trial, Hunter had clung to one memory that everyone else dismissed as the desperate fantasy of a guilty man trying to construct an alternate reality. The shadow in the doorway, the witness who'd seen everything while being seen by no one, the person whose existence his drug-altered mind had registered even as it failed to record his own actions. For 4 years, that shadow had haunted him more than the 17 ghosts of the men he'd allegedly murdered, because that shadow represented the only possible path to truth in a world that had already decided his guilt was absolute. Now, strapped to a timeline that terminated in less than 90 minutes, Hunter would finally learn whether that shadow had been real or whether his mind had created a phantom to shield itself from the unbearable reality of what his hands had done, while his consciousness watched from behind a chemical barrier it couldn't penetrate. Michelle Sparks had learned the art of invisibility long before she ever stepped foot in Hunter Torrance' estate, had mastered the particular mathematics of survival that governed the lives of foreign domestic workers navigating wealthy households in countries that viewed them as necessary infrastructure rather than actual human beings. She'd been 23 when she'd left her small coastal village, carrying a battered suitcase that contained 3 changes of clothes, a photograph of her younger siblings, and the kind of desperate hope that comes from watching your family's fishing boat rot at the dock, because there's no money for repairs and no fish left in waters that had once teemed with life. The agency that recruited her had made promises that sounded almost credible in the suffocating poverty of her hometown. Good wages, respectable employers, opportunities to send money home that would transform her family's circumstances within a few years. What they hadn't mentioned, or had buried in contract language she'd been too eager to properly parse, were the 18-hour days, the confiscated passports, the living quarters that amounted to converted storage spaces, and the unspoken rule that her survival depended on perfecting the ability to exist without leaving any impression on the consciousness of the people she served. Her first placement had been with a banking executive and his wife, a couple who occupied a penthouse that overlooked the city like a glass and steel throne room. Michelle had cleaned their marble bathrooms, prepared their meals according to dietary restrictions that changed with each new wellness trend, and learned within the first week that the most dangerous mistake she could make was to be noticed. The executive's wife had rigid expectations about how quickly tasks should be completed, about the precise angle at which throw pillows should be arranged on leather sofas, about the invisibility of the labor that maintained their lifestyle. When Michelle had once made the error of speaking without being directly addressed, offering a polite observation about the weather while dusting the living room, the woman's face had transformed into something cold and reptilian. "I don't pay you to have opinions about the weather or anything else. I pay you to work silently and make yourself scarce when we have guests." The lesson had calcified into something fundamental in Michelle's understanding of how her world functioned. She'd learned to move through rooms like smoke, to complete tasks so efficiently that her employers could convince themselves the work happened automatically, to position herself in peripheral vision, where the human eye naturally filtered out details that didn't demand attention. She discovered that wealthy people developed a particular blindness to service workers, the same way urban dwellers stopped seeing homeless people on street corners or commuters, stopped noticing the faces of fellow passengers during their daily routines. If she maintained the right posture, wore the prescribed uniform, and kept her eyes downcast at appropriate moments, she could achieve a state of functional invisibility that was both degrading and oddly liberating. Because invisible people, Michelle had realized, witnessed everything. They stood in corners during arguments that revealed the fractures in marriages that looked perfect in family photographs. They overheard phone conversations that exposed financial desperation behind facades of success. They saw the pills hidden in bathroom cabinets, the bottles concealed in closets, the evidence of affairs left carelessly in pockets of expensive suits. The wealthy performed their lives as though the help existed in a separate dimension, as though anything said or done in the presence of a maid simply evaporated the moment she left the room. Her second placement had ended abruptly when the employer's teenage son had developed an unhealthy interest in her that his parents addressed by terminating her contract rather than confronting their child's behavior. Her third placement had lasted 6 months before the household downsized staff, during a financial restructuring that the family discussed openly over dinner, while Mitchell served courses, and apparently ceased to exist as a sentient being who could comprehend their conversation. Each position had reinforced the same truth. Her survival depended on being simultaneously indispensable and forgettable, essential to the functioning of these households, yet invisible enough that her presence never disrupted the comfort of the people who employed her. The agency had placed her with Hunter Torrent during a period when his organization was expanding rapidly, when the estate required additional staff to maintain the increased activity and the heightened standards that came with his rising status in circles that operated outside legal boundaries. Mitchell hadn't known the full nature of his business when she'd accepted the position, had only understood that he was wealthy in ways that made her previous employers look modest by comparison, and that the salary offer was substantial enough to allow her to send money home that could repair her family's boat and pay for her youngest brother's education. What had struck her immediately, on her very first day, was that Hunter Torrent actually looked at her when speaking. Not through her, not past her, but directly at her face with eye contact that suggested he registered her as a person rather than as animated furniture. When he'd introduced himself that first morning, he'd extended his hand for a formal handshake, a gesture so unexpected that she'd hesitated before accepting it. "You'll be working in my home," he'd said in a tone that carried none of the condescension she'd learned to expect, "which means you'll likely see and hear things that are not your concern. I expect discretion, professionalism, and attention to detail. In return, I'll treat you with the same respect I expect from you. Your quarters are private, your working hours are defined in your contract, and if anyone in this household treats you inappropriately, you report it directly to me. Understood?" Mitchell had nodded, too surprised to formulate an adequate verbal response. In 3 years of domestic service, no employer had ever suggested that her comfort or dignity mattered, had ever implied that she possessed any right to respectful treatment. The gesture had been small, perhaps meaningless to Hunter but profound to her, and it had created a paradox in her carefully constructed invisibility. She'd continued to perform her duties with the same efficient silence that had characterized her previous positions, had maintained the same unobtrusive presence that allowed her to move through the estate without drawing attention. But she'd also found herself observing more carefully, paying attention to details that might have otherwise escaped her notice, because this employer had demonstrated that he saw her as something more than interchangeable labor. She'd witnessed the gradual changes in the household dynamics during her 11 months of service. The increasing frequency of meetings that stretched late into the night, the tense conversations conducted in low voices that paused when she entered rooms to refresh coffee or clear dishes. She'd noticed Dalton Graves, the second-in-command who smiled too readily and whose eyes tracked movements with predatory focus, the way he'd begun staying after others left, the way his private conversations with Hunter carried undertones she couldn't quite identify, but that triggered instincts honed by years of reading the invisible currents in households where she didn't belong. On the night of the massacre, Mitchell had been completing her final rounds through the service corridors that ran like hidden arteries through the estate, checking that doors were secured and lights were dimmed in unoccupied rooms. She'd heard the murmur of voices from the conference room, nothing unusual in that, and had been making her way toward the staff quarters when something had made her pause. Perhaps it was the quality of the silence that followed the voices, or perhaps it was simply the instinct that came from years of surviving by reading atmospheres that others ignored. She'd moved closer to the service entrance that provided access to the conference room, had positioned herself in the shadows where the corridor's dim lighting didn't reach, and through the partially open door had witnessed the moment when everything changed. She'd seen Dalton Graves standing over Hunter's slumped form, had watched him retrieve a weapon from somewhere beneath the conference table, had observed with paralyzed horror as he'd methodically executed each person in that room with mechanical precision. And when he'd finished, when 17 bodies had collapsed around the table in the final positions they'd occupy forever. She'd watched him carefully arrange Hunter's fingerprints on the weapon, had seen him place it in Hunter's unresisting hand and fire several additional shots into walls and ceiling to ensure powder residue would coat his employer's skin. Michelle had remained frozen in that doorway for seconds that stretched into eternities. Her mind screaming at her body to move, to run, to do anything except stand there as a witness to mass murder. But movement would have meant sound, and sound would have meant discovery, and discovery would have meant becoming the 18th body. So she'd used the only defense she possessed. She'd remained invisible, had trusted that Dalton's focus on staging the scene would prevent him from noticing the shadow in the service entrance, had prayed to gods she'd stopped believing in that her years of practiced insignificance would save her life one final time. When she'd finally backed away into the corridor, when she'd heard the first sirens approaching in response to triggered alarms, she'd made a decision that had haunted her through 4 years of nightmares and guilt. She'd fled, had packed her few belongings and disappeared into the city's immigrant networks, had eventually secured passage home using money she'd saved and connections that didn't require official documentation. She'd told herself that testifying would change nothing, that her word as a foreign domestic worker would carry no weight against the physical evidence and security footage that made Hunter's guilt appear absolute. She'd convinced herself that survival was not cowardice, that protecting herself was not abandonment. But the shadow of that night had followed her across oceans and continents, and when the prison had contacted her regarding Hunter's final request, she'd known with crushing certainty that her years of invisibility had finally reached their inevitable conclusion. 2 floors above Hunter's cell, in a conference room that served as the administrative nerve center of Greystone Federal Penitentiary, 8 people sat around a government-issue table that had witnessed countless decisions about life, death, and the bureaucratic machinery that connected the two. The warden occupied the head position, his weathered hands folded atop a file folder thick enough to serve as a doorstop, while representatives from the Attorney General's office, the Department of Corrections, the prison's legal counsel, and various oversight committees filled the remaining chairs. A speakerphone sat in the center of the table like a technological oracle, connecting them to officials in the state capitol who couldn't attend in person, but wielded enough authority to halt the execution with a single phone call. Deputy Attorney General Victoria Reeves, a woman whose career had been built on prosecuting organized crime cases that read like fictional thrillers, leaned forward with her elbows on the table and her fingers steepled in front of her face. Let me make sure I understand the situation correctly. We have a condemned man, convicted on overwhelming physical evidence of massacring 17 high-ranking criminals, who has spent 4 years exhausting every legal avenue available to him. His execution is scheduled in less than 90 minutes, and his final request is to speak with a woman who wasn't called as a witness during his trial, who fled the country immediately after the incident, and who has no apparent connection to his case beyond having been employed as domestic help in his home. Does that accurately summarize what we're dealing with? The warden nodded slowly, recognizing that her tone carried implications beyond the surface-level summary. That's correct, though I should note that Mr. Torrent has suggested this woman may possess information relevant to his conviction. He's been somewhat cryptic about the specifics, but he's implied she was present during the incident in some capacity that wasn't documented in the investigation. Marcus Sheffield, the prison's chief legal counsel, a man whose gray beard and reading glasses gave him the appearance of an academic rather than someone who navigated the intersection of criminal justice and constitutional law, cleared his throat. We've reviewed the transcripts from Torrent's trial, and there's no mention of Michelle Sparks in any testimony or evidence presented to the jury. The prosecution built their case entirely on physical evidence, security footage, and forensic analysis. The defense attempted to argue that Torrent was drugged and framed, but they couldn't produce credible witnesses or evidence to support that theory. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 17 counts. Which tells us the case was open and shut from the jury's perspective, interjected Thomas Caldwell, a representative from the Corrections Oversight Committee who'd been taking notes on a yellow legal pad throughout the discussion. But let's address the elephant in the room. Public opinion on the Torrent case has been divided since the verdict. Half the country sees him as exactly what the prosecution portrayed: a paranoid crime lord who eliminated potential rivals in a single night of violence. The other half believes he was set up by someone within his own organization, and that the speed of the trial and conviction suggests the system was eager to close the case without examining alternative theories. The speakerphone crackled to life, transmitting the voice of Governor's legal advisor Sandra Pemberton from the state capitol. The polling data supports that assessment. We've seen consistent splits along various demographic lines about whether justice was properly served in this case. That division creates a political nightmare if new evidence emerges after the execution that suggests we put an innocent man to death. The wrongful execution of a mafia boss might seem like a victimless error to some, but it would still represent a fundamental failure of the justice system. Deputy Attorney General Reeves' expression hardened into something resembling carved granite. "We're not going to relitigate Hunter Torrent's conviction in a prison conference room 90 minutes before his execution. The evidence was reviewed by multiple courts, including the Supreme Court, which declined to hear his appeal. 17 people are dead, and the physical evidence placing him at the scene with the murder weapon is irrefutable. If this maid has information that contradicts the established facts, she's had 4 years to come forward. Why now? Why at literally the last possible moment?" "Because she wasn't asked," the warden replied quietly, drawing sharp glances from around the table. "According to Torrent, the investigation never identified her as someone worth interviewing. She was a domestic worker who apparently left the estate before police arrived. The defense team never found her because they were focused on challenging the physical evidence and the prosecution's timeline. If Torrent is telling the truth about her being present during the massacre, then she's been invisible to everyone involved in this case from the beginning." Assistant Director of Corrections, Raymond Foster, who'd remained silent until this point while scrolling through documents on his tablet, looked up with an expression that suggested he'd found something troubling in the digital records. "I've been reviewing the complete witness list from the investigation. There were 43 people interviewed in connection with the massacre, ranging from Torrent's business associates to security personnel to forensic specialists. But there's no comprehensive list of household staff who were employed at the estate. The investigation focused on people with direct knowledge of Torrent's criminal operations, not on domestic workers who would have been considered peripheral to the core events. Which means," Thomas Caldwell said slowly, connecting implications that made the room's atmosphere feel suddenly heavier. "If this woman was present and witnessed something that contradicts the prosecution's narrative, she represents a gap in the investigation that nobody bothered to close because they assumed the physical evidence told the complete story." Victoria Reeves shook her head with visible frustration. "Or it means a condemned man is executing a final manipulation designed to create doubt and delay his execution. This could be nothing more than a desperate play for time, hoping that introducing a new witness at the 11th hour will trigger appeals or stays of execution that buy him days or weeks or months of additional life. We've seen similar tactics before from defendants who exhaust their legal options and then resort to procedural games." "Except," interjected Marcus Sheffield, removing his reading glasses and setting them on the table with deliberate care, "Torrent has done nothing of the kind throughout his 4 years of incarceration. His appeals have been straightforward, his behavior has been exemplary by prison standards, and he's consistently maintained his innocence while accepting the futility of his legal position. This isn't the profile of someone who engages in last-minute theatrics. His request is bizarre, granted, but it's not accompanied by the usual indicators of manipulation or delay tactics." The speakerphone crackled again, Sandra Pemberton's voice carrying the weight of political calculations that existed beyond the immediate question of one man's guilt or innocence. "Governor's office has been receiving calls from advocacy groups on both sides of this case. Organizations that believe Torrent was wrongfully convicted are demanding clemency reviews. Law enforcement associations and victims' rights groups are insisting the execution proceed as scheduled. There's a protest forming outside the prison gates right now, with demonstrators arguing both positions. Whatever we decide in this room is going to be scrutinized by millions of people who have already made up their minds about what justice looks like in this situation. Raymond Foster set his tablet down and fixed the warden with a direct stare that demanded honesty beyond bureaucratic pleasantries. What's your read on this? You've spent time with Torrent, you've overseen dozens of executions, and you've seen every variation of condemned man behavior that exists. Is he playing us, or is there something legitimate happening here that we're at risk of dismissing because it doesn't fit our expectations? The warden was silent for a long moment, aware that his answer carried implications that extended far beyond the walls of his prison. In 17 years of running this facility, I've learned that guilty men facing execution tend to fall into predictable patterns. They seek forgiveness, they rage against injustice, they deteriorate psychologically, or they achieve a kind of resigned acceptance. Hunter Torrent doesn't fit any of those patterns. He's been waiting for something, has been convinced since his conviction that there's a missing piece to the puzzle of that night. I can't tell you whether his conviction is justified or whether he was framed, but I can tell you that his behavior suggests genuine belief in his own innocence rather than the performance of a guilty man trying to rewrite history. Victoria Reeves stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense atmosphere. We're approaching this from the wrong angle. The question isn't whether Torrent is guilty or innocent. That question was answered by a jury 4 years ago. The question is whether we have a legal obligation to allow this visitation, and whether anything that emerges from it could constitute grounds for intervention in the execution timeline. The answer to the first question is yes. We're bound by regulations that permit final visits with approved individuals. The answer to the second question is that unless this maid produces concrete physical evidence of Torrent's innocence, not testimony, not theories, but actual evidence, we have no grounds to halt the execution. But if she does produce such evidence, Thomas Caldwell countered, and we've already administered the lethal injection, we'll have executed a man who might have been exonerated if we'd just given the system 30 more minutes to function properly. That's the nightmare scenario that keeps appellate judges awake at night. The warden checked his watch, nodding that time was advancing with mechanical indifference to their philosophical debates. The visitation is scheduled to begin in 45 minutes. Michelle Sparks is being transported to the facility now under escort. The meeting will be monitored and recorded per standard protocol. If she reveals information that appears credible and substantive, we'll have approximately 30 minutes to decide whether it constitutes grounds for requesting a stay from the governor's office or a federal court. That's the reality of our timeline. Sandra Pemberton's voice emerged from the speakerphone with the finality of someone delivering an ultimatum. Then here's what's going to happen. The visitation proceeds as scheduled. If the maid provides testimony or evidence that genuinely calls into question the conviction, the warden immediately contacts my office, and we initiate emergency appeals protocols. But the burden of proof is extraordinary at this stage. We're not looking for reasonable doubt, we're looking for demonstrable evidence of actual innocence. Anything less, and the execution proceeds as scheduled at 900 hours. Are we clear? Around the table, heads nodded in reluctant agreement. Each person present understanding they were participating in a moment that would either vindicate the justice system's careful deliberation or expose its catastrophic failure to see what had been invisible all along. The visitation room existed in a state of perpetual sterility, a space designed to facilitate human connection while simultaneously preventing any genuine intimacy or comfort. Green-painted concrete walls rose to meet a ceiling dotted with cameras that captured every angle, every gesture, every micro-expression that passed between the condemned and their visitors. A metal table bolted to the floor separated 2 chairs that were themselves anchored to concrete, eliminating any possibility of movement beyond what the restraints permitted. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead with a particular frequency that seemed to exist exclusively in institutional settings. casting everything in a flat, colorless light that drained warmth from human skin and made the living appear only marginally more vital than the dead. Hunter sat on one side of the table, his hands secured to a metal ring by short chain restraints that allowed limited movement, but prevented any possibility of violence. 4 guards occupied the corners of the room, their positions calculated to provide maximum coverage and minimum response time should the situation deteriorate. Behind a one-way mirror that occupied the entire eastern wall, the warden and his delegation watched with recording equipment that would capture every syllable spoken in this room for potential legal review. The door opened with the pneumatic hiss of industrial hinges, and Mitchell Sparks entered flanked by 2 additional guards who treated her with the cautious courtesy extended to civilians entering a maximum security environment. She wore the same uniform Hunter remembered from his estate, a black dress with white collar and cuffs, sensible shoes that made no sound against the concrete floor, her dark hair pulled back in a style that emphasized functionality over aesthetics. But her face had changed in ways that 4 years and accumulated trauma could accomplish. Lines etched around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and the particular exhaustion that comes from carrying knowledge too heavy for one person to bear alone. She stopped at the threshold, her eyes finding Hunter across the sterile space, and for a moment neither of them moved or spoke. The guards guided her to the chair opposite him, their hands hovering near her elbows without quite making contact, and once she was seated they retreated to positions near the door that allowed them to intervene, while maintaining the illusion of privacy that final visitations required. 15 minutes, one of the guards announced, his voice flat with the emotional detachment that came from witnessing too many goodbye conversations between people who would never see each other again. Physical contact is prohibited. Raising voices or using threatening language will result in immediate termination of the visit. Time begins now. Hunter leaned forward slightly, the chains of his restraints producing a soft metallic sound that seemed disproportionately loud in the oppressive quiet. "You came. I wasn't certain you would." Michelle's hands rested on the table in front of her, fingers interlaced with the same habitual precision he remembered from the countless times he'd seen her moving through his home, always proper, always controlled. "I almost didn't. I bought the plane ticket 3 times and canceled it twice. But then I realized that running away 4 years ago made me complicit in what happened to you, and I couldn't let that cowardice define the rest of my life." "You're not a coward," Hunter said quietly, his voice carrying none of the commanding authority that had once characterized his speech, but instead holding something softer, more human. "You survived a massacre by being smart enough to stay invisible. That's not cowardice. That's the kind of intelligence that keeps people alive in situations where heroism just gets you killed." She shook her head slowly, her eyes glistening with moisture that hadn't yet formed into actual tears. "I watched Dalton Graves murder 17 people while you sat there drugged and helpless, unable to even defend yourself. And then I ran away and let the world believe you did it. That's not survival. That's abandonment." The name hung in the air between them like a physical presence, and Hunter felt something inside his chest release its grip, a tension he'd carried for so long it had become part of his baseline existence. "Say that again. Say exactly what you saw that night, because I need to hear it from someone who was actually there, someone who doesn't have a reason to lie to me." Michelle drew a shaky breath, her composure beginning to fracture at the edges. "I was finishing my rounds through the service corridors when something made me pause near the conference room entrance. I don't know what exactly, maybe just instinct from years of reading atmospheres in houses where I didn't belong. I moved closer to the doorway, and I saw you slumped in your chair at the head of the table, your head hanging forward like you'd fallen asleep, except your breathing was wrong, too shallow and irregular." The others around the table were looking at each other with confusion, starting to ask questions about what was happening to you. Her voice steadied as she continued, taking on the quality of testimony that had been rehearsed mentally for years but never spoken aloud. "Dalton stood up from his seat to your right. He said something about calling for medical help, and 2 of the others started to rise from their chairs. But instead of going to the phone, Dalton reached under the conference table and pulled out a weapon that must have been taped there beforehand." The first shot hit the financial advisor in the chest before anyone could react. After that, it was methodical. He moved around the table, shooting each person with the kind of precision that made it clear he'd planned exactly how this would unfold. Hunter's jaw clenched, muscles working beneath the skin as he processed confirmation of what he'd suspected but could never prove. How long did it take, from the first shot to the last? Maybe 90 seconds, 2 minutes at most. Nobody fought back because it happened so fast and because they couldn't process that one of their own was executing them. When he finished, when everyone else was dead or dying, he walked back to where you were sitting. You were still conscious but completely unresponsive, your eyes open but seeing nothing. He wiped down the weapon he'd used, then took your personal gun from the holster you wore under your jacket. He fired it several times into the walls and ceiling, then carefully wrapped your fingers around the grip and pressed your hand against various surfaces to transfer residue and prints. "Did he see you?" Hunter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, I thought he did. He looked toward the service entrance while he was staging the scene, and his eyes swept across the doorway where I was standing. But I'd already learned that if you stay perfectly still in shadows, people's eyes pass right over you. Their brains filter you out as furniture or architectural features, especially if they're focused on something else. He was so concentrated on arranging the evidence that his mind didn't register that the shadow in the doorway had human shape. One of the guards shifted his weight, and the slight sound made both Hunter and Mitchell glance toward the corners of the room, remembering they weren't alone, that this conversation was being recorded and analyzed by people who would decide whether her testimony constituted sufficient grounds to halt an execution that was now less than an hour away. "Tell me about his face," Hunter said, his eyes locked on Mitchell's with desperate intensity. "You said in your message through the warden that you saw his mask fall. What did you mean?" Mitchell's composure finally broke, tears spilling down her cheeks as she allowed herself to fully revisit the memory she'd tried to suppress for 4 years. When he first stood up and said he was going to get help, his face showed exactly what you'd expect. Concern, maybe confusion about why you were acting strange. But the moment he pulled that weapon from under the table, everything changed. The concern vanished completely, replaced by this cold, focused expression that was completely devoid of emotion. It was like watching someone remove a mask to reveal what they'd been hiding underneath all along. And in that moment, I understood that everything I'd witnessed between you and him, all the loyalty and partnership that seemed to define your relationship, had been performance on his part. He'd been waiting for this opportunity, planning it, and the only thing I couldn't figure out was how long he'd been preparing to take your place. 4 months, Hunter said, his voice hollow with the weight of betrayal confirmed. I found financial irregularities in the accounts he managed about 4 months before the massacre. Nothing major, just small discrepancies that suggested he was skimming or setting up unauthorized side operations. I confronted him privately, gave him a chance to explain before I took more serious action. He apologized, claimed it was bookkeeping errors, promised to correct everything. I thought I was being merciful by giving him an opportunity to fix his mistakes instead of making an example of him. What I actually did was sign my own execution warrant by letting him know I was paying attention. He couldn't risk you looking deeper into his operations, Mitchell said, the pieces of a conspiracy clicking into place through their shared testimony. So he decided to eliminate you and everyone else who might have noticed the same irregularities. One massacre that looked like your paranoid purge of potential rivals, and suddenly he's the sole surviving leader of your entire organization with no one left to question his authority or audit his accounts. The guard near the door raised his hand, a gesture that indicated their time was running short. 5 minutes remaining. Hunter's hands strained against the restraints, not in an attempt to break free, but simply as a physical manifestation of the urgency that flooded through him. The security footage showed me committing the murders. How do you explain that if what you're saying is true? Mitchell nodded as if she'd been expecting this question, had spent years analyzing every detail of how Dalton had engineered the perfect frame. The drugs he put in your wine, they didn't knock you unconscious completely. They put you in a state where you could still move if someone physically manipulated your body, like a puppet that could stand and walk and hold objects, but had no will of its own. After he placed your gun in your hand and fired those shots to create residue patterns, he lifted you to your feet and walked you around the table. He positioned you at specific angles and triggered the gun while supporting your arm, making it appear on camera like you were the one aiming and firing. Your body was present for every shot. Your hand was on the weapon. But your consciousness had been chemically removed from the equation. The revelation hit Hunter with physical force, confirming the nightmare scenario his drug-hazed memories had suggested, but could never definitively prove. And then he called the police himself, knowing they'd find me standing there with the murder weapon, covered in residue, with security footage that made my guilt look absolute. He gambled that no one would question the obvious narrative, Mitchell confirmed, and he was right. The physical evidence was so overwhelming that nobody looked deeper for alternative explanations. Hunter's mind raced through implications and timelines, calculating how much of Mitchell's testimony would hold up under legal scrutiny versus how much would be dismissed as unprovable allegations from a biased witness. Eyewitness testimony alone, particularly from someone who'd fled the scene and waited 4 years to come forward, wouldn't be sufficient to halt an execution that was now 40 minutes away. He needed something concrete, something that existed independently of human memory and interpretation, something that could be verified and analyzed by experts who had no stake in the outcome. "Your testimony explains what happened," Hunter said, his words coming faster now as precious seconds evaporated into the institutional air around them. "But testimony without corroboration is just one person's word against established evidence. The courts won't reopen my case based solely on what you witnessed, not at this stage, not with this little time remaining. We need physical proof that Dalton drugged me, that he manipulated my body to create the security footage, that he orchestrated the entire massacre as a calculated takeover rather than as my paranoid purge." Mitchell's expression shifted, something resolving in her features that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment, had been carrying knowledge that weighed more than mere observation. "I know. I realized that 4 years ago when I was deciding whether to come forward. I knew my testimony alone wouldn't be enough, that I'd be dismissed as a domestic worker with unclear motivations trying to inject herself into a high-profile case. So before I left the estate that night, while sirens were approaching and chaos was beginning to erupt, I took something that I hoped might matter someday if the truth ever had a chance to surface." Hunter leaned forward as far as his restraints would permit, every muscle in his body tensing with desperate anticipation. "What did you take?" "Not what I took," Mitchell corrected, her voice steady despite the tears still tracking down her face. "What I found and left exactly where it was, because moving it would have made it inadmissible as evidence. Your estate had a primary security system that recorded everything to servers in your main office. That's the footage the prosecution used at trial, the footage that showed you apparently committing the murders. But what the investigators didn't know, what maybe only you and your head of security knew, was that you had a backup system. A secondary recording apparatus that captured footage from different angles and stored it on an independent drive that wasn't connected to your main network." The memory surfaced in Hunter's mind like something excavated from archaeological depths, a security measure he'd implemented years earlier at the suggestion of his head of security, a man named Victor who'd been killed in the massacre, along with the others. Victor had been paranoid about digital vulnerabilities, had insisted that any system connected to a network could be compromised or manipulated by someone with sufficient technical knowledge. He'd advocated for a completely isolated backup system that recorded to a physical drive, stored in a location that only Victor and Hunter knew about, a failsafe against the possibility that the primary system could be hacked or its footage altered. "The laundry room," Hunter breathed, the location materializing in his consciousness with sudden, crystalline clarity. Victor installed a camera disguised as a smoke detector in the service corridor that ran past the conference room, and the feed recorded to a drive hidden behind a false panel in the industrial laundry facility. The footage wouldn't have the same quality or angles as the primary system, but it would have captured the corridor and potentially part of the conference room entrance from a perspective the main cameras didn't cover. Mitchell nodded, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if anchoring herself against the weight of what she was revealing. After I saw what Dalton did, after I backed away into the corridor and stood there trying to process what I'd witnessed, I remembered that smoke detector. I'd cleaned that corridor hundreds of times and had noticed it looked slightly different from the others, positioned at an odd angle that didn't make sense for actual smoke detection. I'd asked Victor about it once, just casual conversation while I was working, and he'd smiled and said some detectors serve multiple purposes, but I shouldn't mention it to anyone. I didn't understand what he meant until that night. The guard near the door raised his hand again, his voice cutting through the mounting tension. 2 minutes remaining. Hunter's words tumbled out in an urgent rush, years of suppressed hope suddenly crystallizing into something that might actually constitute salvation. If that drive still exists, if it wasn't discovered and removed during the investigation, the footage would show the service corridor from an angle that captured both my office entrance and the conference room doorway. It would show Dalton entering my office earlier in the evening, possibly to drug the wine before the meeting started. It would show me walking to the conference room in a normal state, and it might show enough of the corridor to capture part of what happened inside after I was incapacitated. Drive has a 6-digit password, Mitchell said, speaking rapidly as their time evaporated. I saw you enter it once when I was cleaning nearby, and you were reviewing footage after a security concern. I have an excellent memory for numbers. It's a survival skill from years of remembering banking details and account codes for employers who expected me to handle their financial tasks. The password is 730,291. Does that number mean anything to you? Hunter felt something break open in his chest, a combination of anguish and vindication, so intense it bordered on physical pain. It's the date my father died. July 30th, 1991. Victor knew that date because we'd discussed it during one of the few conversations where I'd talked about anything personal. He suggested I use it for the backup system password because it was memorable to me but wouldn't be obvious to anyone else. Mitchell pulled a small piece of paper from her pocket, moving slowly so the guards wouldn't interpret the gesture as threatening. She slid it across the metal table until it reached the center point between herself and Hunter. On it, written in precise handwriting, was a detailed description of the false panel's location in the laundry room, behind the third industrial washing machine from the eastern wall, accessible by removing 4 screws from a maintenance panel that appeared to be part of the ventilation system. I visited the estate 3 days ago, she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. It's been sold twice since your conviction, currently owned by a tech entrepreneur who's renovating it. The laundry facility is scheduled for demolition next week as part of a complete redesign of that wing. But as of 3 days ago, the panel was still there, and I could see the edge of the drives casing through a gap in the maintenance access. Nobody's found it because nobody's had a reason to look, and the new owners have no idea about the security systems that existed before they purchased the property. The door opened and the guard stepped forward, his posture indicating that the 15-minute window had closed and the visitation was concluded. Time's up. Ms. Sparks, you'll be escorted out of the facility. Mr. Torrent, you'll be returned to your cell for final preparations. Hunter rose to his feet, his restraints forcing his movements into awkward rigidity, and his eyes locked onto Mitchell's with intensity that transcended the limitations of language. Thank you for coming back, for risking whatever judgment you'll face for staying silent this long, for giving me the chance to die knowing I was right about what I thought I remembered. Mitchell stood as well, tears flowing freely now as the emotional restraint she'd maintained throughout the conversation finally collapsed. You treated me like a human being when everyone else treated me like furniture. That small kindness is the only reason I paid attention that night. The only reason I remembered details that might actually matter. I hope this is enough. I hope the drive still works and the footage is recoverable and that someone believes what it shows before they. She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't give voice to the execution that was now less than 30 minutes away. The guards moved in to separate them, to guide them toward their respective doors and the divergent paths that would lead one to freedom and the other to death or some last-minute reprieve that existed only as the most fragile possibility. As Mitchell reached the threshold, she turned back one final time, her voice carrying across the sterile space with surprising strength. I saw the truth. Whatever happens now, at least the truth exists somewhere other than my nightmares. That has to count for something. Behind the one-way mirror, the warden was already reaching for his phone, his fingers moving with urgent precision as he dialed the first in a series of numbers that would set in motion an emergency response unprecedented in Greystone's history. The clock on the wall read 8:32 hours. 28 minutes until the execution protocol would begin its irreversible sequence. 28 minutes to verify the existence of evidence that had been hidden in plain sight for 4 years. 28 minutes to determine whether the justice system could correct a catastrophic error before it became permanent. The execution chamber existed in a state of clinical precision that stripped away all pretense of humanity, reducing the act of state-sanctioned death to a medical procedure performed with the same sterile efficiency as routine surgery. Hunter was led through the final doorway at 8:47 hours, his orange jumpsuit replaced with the simple cotton garments the warden had described, his feet shuffling in institutional slippers that made no sound against the polished floor. 4 guards flanked him, their hands positioned near his elbows without actually making contact, a practiced formation that communicated control without overt aggression. The gurney waited in the center of the room like an altar, its leather restraints hanging open in anticipation, its surface covered with a thin white sheet that would be the last thing Hunter felt against his skin before sensation ceased entirely. He moved toward it without resistance, without the trembling or collapse that some condemned men exhibited when confronted with the machinery of their own mortality. His training in controlling fear, cultivated through years of operating in environments where showing weakness meant inviting attack, served him even now as he positioned himself on the gurney with mechanical compliance. The guards worked with rehearsed efficiency, securing the restraints across his chest, his wrists, his ankles, pulling each strap tight enough to eliminate movement but not so tight as to cause unnecessary pain. The state prided itself on humane execution, on the fiction that death could be administered with dignity if only the proper protocols were observed. The medical technician entered through a side door, a young woman whose face remained professionally neutral as she prepared the IV equipment that would serve as the delivery mechanism for the 3-stage chemical sequence. She worked in silence, her movements precise and economical, selecting veins in each of Hunter's extended arms and inserting needles with the practiced competence of someone who'd performed this task enough times to strip it of emotional content. The saline solution began flowing immediately, keeping the lines open and ready for the chemicals that would follow once the observation curtains opened and the official witnesses confirmed their presence. Hunter stared at the ceiling, his eyes tracing the patterns in the acoustic tiles that someone had installed with the misguided belief that sound dampening would somehow make this room less terrible. His thoughts moved between the present moment and the frantic activity he knew was unfolding beyond these walls, somewhere in the administrative offices, where the warden was coordinating an emergency response that had never been attempted in the facility's history. The visitation with Mitchell had concluded 23 minutes ago, which meant that somewhere right now, a team was racing toward his former estate with authorization to search for evidence that might not exist, might have been destroyed, might be corrupted beyond recovery even if located. The warden entered the chamber, his presence carrying the weight of authority and something else that Hunter recognized as profound discomfort with the role he was required to perform. He positioned himself at the head of the gurney, where Hunter could see him without straining against the restraints, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the bureaucratic detachment that had characterized their earlier interactions. Mr. Torrent, I need to inform you that we are currently pursuing verification of information provided during your final visitation. A team has been dispatched to your former estate with emergency authorization to search for the backup security drive that Ms. Sparks described. However, you need to understand the reality of our timeline. It's now 8:52 hours. The curtains to the observation gallery will open at 8:59, and the first chemical will be administered at 900, unless we receive a formal stay order from a court with jurisdiction to halt the execution. Hunter's voice emerged steady despite the position he occupied, despite the needles in his arms and the restraints that held him immobile. "How long does it take to reach the estate, locate the drive, and verify its contents?" The warden's expression answered the question before his words did. "Under ideal circumstances, with minimal traffic and immediate location of the evidence, we're looking at 45 minutes minimum. That's assuming the drive exists, assuming it's accessible, assuming it contains recoverable footage, and assuming that footage is clear enough to constitute credible evidence. We don't have 45 minutes. We have 8 minutes before the protocol commences. Then you're going to execute me while evidence of my innocence potentially sits in a laundry room waiting to be found." Hunter's tone carried no accusation, only the flat statement of reality that both men understood. "Unless a court intervenes based on Miss Sparks' testimony alone, yes." The warden paused, something human breaking through his professional facade. "I've contacted every relevant authority. The Attorney General's office is reviewing the visitation recording. The governor's legal team has been briefed. Federal judges have been notified of the potential new evidence. But none of them can halt this execution without following proper legal procedures, and those procedures require more time than we have available." The observation gallery curtains remained closed, but Hunter could sense the presence of witnesses gathering behind them, taking their assigned seats to observe the culmination of a process that had begun 4 years ago in a conference room thick with incense smoke. Among those witnesses would be family members of the 17 men killed that night, people who believed they were about to see justice delivered for crimes that had destroyed their lives. The bitter irony that they were actually witnessing the final act of Dalton Graves' conspiracy would be lost on them. Another layer of victimization that extended beyond the immediate casualties of that massacre. The medical technician checked the IV lines one final time, confirmed the flow of saline solution, and retreated to her monitoring station, where screens displayed Hunter's vital signs in real-time graphs that would track his journey from life to death with clinical precision. His heart rate remained steady at 72 beats per minute, his blood pressure elevated, but within expected parameters for someone in his circumstances, his oxygen saturation optimal. All systems functioning normally, ready to be systematically shut down by chemicals that would flow through those same veins, carrying the blood his heart pumped with mechanical reliability. A phone mounted on the wall near the warden's position remained silent, its red light unilluminated, indicating no incoming calls from the courts or the governor's office. That silence represented the absence of intervention, the void where a stay order should exist but didn't, the space between Hunter's current state of living and his approaching state of death that was measured in minutes that continued their relentless countdown. The warden received a signal through his earpiece, some confirmation from the observation gallery that all required witnesses were present and the execution could proceed according to schedule. He moved to the wall console that controlled the curtains, his hand hovering over the button that would open them and transform this private moment into a public spectacle, observed by people who believed they understood what they were witnessing. "Mr. Torrent," the warden said quietly, his voice pitched for Hunter's ears alone rather than for the microphones that recorded everything said in this chamber. "If there's anything you want to say, any final statement you want recorded, now is the time." Hunter's eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, his breathing controlled and measured. "I want it noted that I maintained my innocence to the end. I want it noted that evidence potentially exists that would exonerate me if anyone bothers to look for it. And I want it noted that Dalton Graves is the one who should be on this gurney, not me. Beyond that, I have nothing to say to people who have already decided what they believe." The warden nodded, his expression suggesting he would ensure those statements were included in the official record, even if they changed nothing about the immediate outcome. His hand moved to the button, prepared to open the curtains and initiate the sequence that would end with Hunter's heart ceasing its reliable rhythm, and his brain being deprived of the oxygen it needed to sustain consciousness and life. The phone on the wall erupted with sudden, piercing sound that shattered the chamber's oppressive quiet like glass breaking in a silent room. The red light blazed to life, pulsing with urgent insistence. The warden's hand froze millimeters from the curtain control, his entire body going rigid as he processed the implications of that ringing phone at this precise moment in the execution timeline. He crossed the chamber in 3 long strides, lifting the receiver with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly despite his decades of experience maintaining composure under pressure. "This is Warden Phillips." His voice was carefully neutral, betraying nothing of the hope or dread that must be warring inside him. The chamber fell into absolute silence, except for the quiet hum of medical equipment and the sound of Hunter's breathing, steady despite the adrenaline that must be flooding his system, as he recognized that the ringing phone might represent the difference between death in the next 60 seconds or life, extending into some uncertain future. The warden listened, his face remaining impassive as information flowed through the phone line from whatever authority had made this 11th-hour contact. Seconds stretched into subjective eternities as Hunter lay immobilized on the gurney, his fate balanced on whatever words were being spoken into the warden's ear. The clock on the wall read 8:58 hours. 2 minutes until the scheduled commencement of the protocol that would inject sodium thiopental into his veins and begin the irreversible cascade toward death. "Understood," the warden finally said, his voice carefully modulated to reveal nothing. "I'll inform the witnesses and medical team. Yes, I'll await further instructions." He returned the phone to its cradle with deliberate precision, then turned to face Hunter with an expression that seemed carved from something harder than mere stone, something that had absorbed too much death and too many final moments to retain easy human emotion. "Mr. Torrent, I've received a temporary stay of execution from the Federal District Court. The execution is suspended pending investigation of the new evidence described in your final visitation. You will be returned to your cell while authorities pursue verification." 6 months after the emergency team had extracted the backup security drive from behind a false panel in the laundry room of his former estate, Hunter Torrent walked out of Greystone Federal Penitentiary through the main entrance rather than the administrative exit typically used for released inmates. The footage recovered from that drive had been everything Michelle promised and more, capturing angles that revealed Dalton Graves entering Hunter's private office 40 minutes before the scheduled meeting, showed him accessing the wine collection with a small vial he'd concealed in his jacket, documented the careful way he'd returned everything to its original position before joining the others. The secondary camera had also recorded fragments of the massacre itself through the conference room doorway. Images grainy and partially obscured, but sufficient to show Dalton methodically executing men who'd believed they were attending a routine business meeting, then manipulating Hunter's drugged body to create the security footage that had seemed to prove his guilt beyond doubt. The chemical analysis of wine residue found in Hunter's glass, preserved as evidence but never tested for anything beyond alcohol content, revealed traces of a powerful sedative cocktail that would have rendered him conscious but incapable of voluntary action, exactly as Michelle had described. Dalton Graves had been arrested 3 months ago in Singapore, living under an assumed identity and managing what remained of the organization he'd stolen through murder and meticulous framing. His trial was scheduled for the following year, and prosecutors were pursuing 17 counts of first-degree murder, along with conspiracy charges that could keep him imprisoned for multiple lifetimes. Hunter descended the prison steps, carrying nothing except a small bag containing the few personal items that had accumulated during his years of incarceration. Photographs of family members who'd abandoned him long before his conviction, legal documents that chronicled his journey through appellate courts, and letters from Michelle that had arrived with increasing frequency once the truth had been established. The media circus that had assembled outside the gates pressed forward against police barriers, cameras and microphones thrust toward him like weapons, reporters shouting questions about his plans for rebuilding his criminal empire, whether he intended to seek revenge against those who'd testified against him, how much compensation he'd demand from the state for his wrongful imprisonment. He ignored all of it, moving through the chaos with the same focused determination that had characterized his final hours on death row, his eyes fixed on a point beyond the crowd where a modest sedan waited with Mitchell behind the wheel. She'd been the only person he'd wanted present for his release, the only witness to his incarceration's end, just as she'd been the only witness to the truth of its beginning. The cameras captured his progress, would broadcast images of the tattooed former crime lord walking away from prison to audiences that had followed his case, with the morbid fascination, people reserved for falls from power and 11th-hour redemptions. He opened the passenger door and slid into the seat, the simple act of choosing where to sit and how to position his body feeling almost surreal after years of having every movement dictated by institutional regulations. Mitchell pulled away from the curb before he'd fully closed the door, navigating through the crowd with practiced efficiency that suggested she'd anticipated the media presence and planned her escape route accordingly. They drove in silence for the first 20 minutes, putting distance between themselves and Greystone until the prison's watchtowers disappeared from the rearview mirror, and the landscape transformed into ordinary suburbs where ordinary people lived ordinary lives that had never intersected with maximum security cells or execution chambers. Hunter watched the world pass through the passenger window, absorbing details that had become foreign during his isolation. Children playing in front yards, couples walking dogs along sidewalks, the casual normalcy of existence that continued regardless of whether justice was served or perverted. "Your attorney called yesterday," Mitchell finally said, breaking the silence with information rather than emotion. "The civil suit against the state has been settled. The compensation package is substantial enough that you'll never need to work again, assuming you manage it responsibly. He's also fielded multiple offers from your former organization, people who want you to resume leadership now that your name has been cleared and Dalton's betrayal is public knowledge. Apparently, there's significant support for your return among the remaining operatives." Hunter's expression remained neutral, his gaze still focused on the passing landscape. "What did you tell them?" "That they should direct all inquiries to you, and that I had no insight into your intentions." She paused, her hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel. "But I'm asking now, not as a messenger but as someone who has a stake in what you do next. Are you going back to that life?" The question hung between them, carrying implications that extended beyond simple curiosity about his future plans. Hunter had spent the 6 months between his stay of execution and his eventual exoneration thinking about exactly this question, lying in his cell and imagining what freedom might look like if he actually achieved it. The easy path would be to reclaim his throne, to rebuild the empire that Dalton had fractured through betrayal and mismanagement, to reassert dominance in markets that had fragmented during his absence. He possessed the knowledge, the connections, and now the vindication that would allow him to resurrect his criminal enterprise with relative ease. "No," he said quietly, the single word carrying the weight of a decision that had crystallized over months of forced reflection. "That life put 17 men in graves and nearly put me in one beside them. It turned someone I trusted into a murderer willing to massacre an entire room of people just to advance his position. It created an environment where human life had value only in terms of profit margins and territorial control. I built something monstrous, and the fact that I didn't personally pull the trigger that night doesn't absolve me of responsibility for creating the conditions that made that massacre possible." Mitchell glanced at him briefly before returning her attention to the road, something like relief flickering across her features. "So what will you do instead? The world knows your face, knows your history. You can't exactly disappear into suburban anonymity and expect people to forget who you were." "I can go somewhere that doesn't know my face, where my history is irrelevant because the people have their own concerns that don't include American crime syndicates or high-profile legal cases." Hunter pulled a worn envelope from his jacket pocket, the paper soft with handling, and extracted a photograph that showed a small coastal village with weathered buildings and fishing boats pulled up on a narrow beach. "This is where you're from, isn't it? The place you left to work as a domestic laborer because there were no opportunities and your family's boat was rotting." She looked at the photograph, her eyes widening with recognition and surprise. "How did you get that? I never told you specifically where I was from, just that it was a fishing village. I had resources even in prison, people who could conduct research on my behalf. After you came forward and the investigation started, I wanted to understand what had brought you to my estate, what circumstances had created the invisibility that allowed you to witness the truth when everyone else was blind to it. He returned the photograph to the envelope with careful precision. Your village's economy collapsed because commercial fishing operations depleted the waters and climate change disrupted traditional patterns. The young people leave because there's no future in a place where the sea no longer provides. But the village still exists, still needs people willing to invest in sustainable alternatives and community rebuilding. Michelle's hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, her composure cracking as she processed what he was suggesting. You want to go to my village? To do what exactly? Charity work, some kind of redemption project that lets you feel better about your past. I want to go somewhere I can be useful without being powerful, where I can contribute to something constructive instead of destructive. Your village needs capital investment, technical expertise in sustainable fishing practices, and labor willing to do unglamorous work that rebuilds infrastructure. I have money now from the settlement. I have time that was supposed to end on an execution gurney, and I have skills that transfer from criminal logistics to legitimate community development. It's not redemption. Redemption would require me to undo harm I've caused, and 17 men are still dead regardless of whether I personally killed them. But it might be penance, a way of spending whatever years I have left creating something instead of destroying. She pulled the car onto a side road and stopped, shifting into park before turning to face him fully. Her eyes searched his face with intensity that suggested she was trying to determine whether his words represented genuine transformation or merely sophisticated performance. The people in my village, they're not going to care about your exoneration or your suffering or your philosophical evolution. They're going to see a wealthy foreigner with criminal tattoos trying to buy his way into their community. They're going to be suspicious of your motives and resistant to your presence until you prove through sustained action that you're there for reasons beyond self-interest. I know, Hunter replied, his voice carrying the quiet acceptance of someone who'd already calculated those obstacles and decided they were worth confronting. I'm not expecting gratitude or immediate acceptance. I'm expecting to be viewed with suspicion and skepticism, to have my every action scrutinized for hidden agendas, to work twice as hard as anyone else to achieve half the credibility. That's appropriate given my history. The fact that I was framed for specific murders doesn't erase the reality that I built an organization responsible for substantial harm across multiple continents. I don't get to walk away from that legacy just because a court declared me innocent of one particular crime. Michelle was quiet for a long moment, her expression cycling through emotions that Hunter couldn't fully read, but recognized as complex evaluation of risks and possibilities. Finally, she shifted the car back into drive and pulled onto the road, heading toward the airport where tickets waited in both their names for a flight that would carry them across an ocean to a place where Hunter Torrant's name meant nothing, and his tattooed hands would be judged only by the work they performed. My mother still lives in the village, she said as they merged onto the highway. She's going to have questions about why I'm bringing home a foreign man with obvious criminal markings who claims he wants to help rebuild the fishing economy. What should I tell her? Hunter watched the landscape blur past, the miles accumulating between his former life and whatever uncertain future awaited in a coastal village that had never heard of Greystone Federal Penitentiary or the massacre that had nearly ended with his execution. Tell her the truth. Tell her I'm someone who owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid, and that I'm hopping to spend the rest of my life trying anyway. Tell her I'm not expecting forgiveness or even acceptance, just the opportunity to be useful in ways that don't require anyone to die or suffer for my benefit. Tell her I'm tired of being a dragon, and I'm ready to learn what it means to simply be human. The airport appeared on the horizon, its control tower rising above the surrounding buildings like a marker, indicating the boundary between the world Hunter was leaving behind and the one he'd chosen to enter. As Michelle navigated toward the departure terminal, Hunter felt the weight of his past settling into something he'd carry forever, but no longer had to define his future. The tattoos covering his arms would remain, permanent reminders of the life he'd built and the prices paid for ambition untempered by conscience. But in a village where people measured worth by different standards, perhaps those marks could become simply decorative scars rather than declarations of identity. The dragon was leaving his cave not to conquer new territory, but to discover whether claws designed for destruction could learn gentler purposes in soil that had never been stained with his particular brand of violence.